I think everyone knows that it's been a year of elections, around 70 we've had or going to have in 2024. And surely in most countries, one of the biggest issues has been the cost of living. And that is surely a factor when people are making decisions around whether or not to have a child.
I think it is the main factor that I've heard anecdotally when I speak to people, but also in the research that I've seen. In the UK now, it costs about 200,000 over a child's lifetime. That's the cost of
I was
having a child.
horrified when I saw that.
And it's incredible that anyone can afford that. Research came out earlier this year that it's surveys where they speak to young people, Gen Zs and millennials, about their fertility intentions. So they ask, do you intend to have children? If so, how many? The responses were quite shocking. Almost half of the people who've never had children said they had no plans to, and that was profoundly linked to financial insecurity. So where people felt they were financially insecure, where they felt they were less well off than their parents' generation, they were much more likely not to want a child or to think it was unlikely for them to have a child. The researchers I spoke to who've been working on these surveys said it's not that surprising in this country where you have the age at where you get your first mortgage is creeping right up into the late 30s. Childcare is famously unaffordable. And housing, we're seeing housing crises, not just here in the UK, but any country that's experiencing mass urbanization, we have this problem with housing. So there's a great study that's been done in Europe for the past few years, but it's just recently come to the UK, and it's talking to millennials and Gen Z about lots of different aspects of their lives, but part of it is about their fertility intentions. Dr. Bernice Kuang is at the University of Southampton, and she's been looking at the results of that survey, and some of it's really surprising.
What we found was that actually there has been a pretty big increase in the proportion of young people who say that they are either not sure they're going to have kids or definitely won't have children. And this is a big change from older generations, like previous cohorts. When they were of childbearing age, they weren't saying, oh, no, 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 never, or unsure. So it's not just like, oh, young people are never sure and then they change their minds. It's not that. It does seem like there's like a social change where increasingly people are saying, no, they don't plan to have children. You could say about half of childless men and women are either unsure whether they will have a child or say they will not, which is a substantial increase in negative fertility intentions. So childless men and women, like, 18 to 35, who could still have time to have kids.
In some of the countries that are most profoundly affected by fertility decline, like East Asia, it's the cost of education that they talk about when they discuss their decision not to have children or to have fewer children.
And what about some of the social and cultural impacts? I mean, there are rapidly changing expectations of the genders in our society as well.
So that has had a profound impact, and it's been really well studied, especially in East Asia, where you have some of the highest participation of women in the workforce and education, and at the same time, really unequal distribution of work at home. I found this when I've spoken to women in South Korea or Japan about whether they want to have children or not, and they see their friends who already have children really struggling to keep up at work, struggling to keep up with the long working hours when they're expected to do everything at home. Some really good research into this in Japan that found when Japanese men get married, the amount of housework that they do doesn't change at all. And whereas when Japanese women get married, it changes dramatically. You have this big disconnect between what people are doing when it comes to childcare, housework, all of that. And for a lot of the women I've spoken to, they say, I just don't want that lifestyle. I don't want that life.
What about in countries that have quite progressive paternity leave, for instance? Does that make a difference?
So it definitely did. And this is really interesting because there was a time period where the Scandinavian countries were celebrated for battling fertility decline. So the fertility levels had dropped, but then picked up again. And this was the 90s and the early 2000s. And that was always put down to their really progressive pro-family policies. So paternity leave being equally shared between parents, which affected this gender divide at home. So men and women were doing more equal share of the work at home. And also it was expected that mums and dads would say leave work if their child was sick or take time off when they needed to. And also they had very affordable childcare. But that progress in stopping fertility decline stalled at some point, and those policies didn't seem to be doing the job anymore. And that's really confused demographers and sociologists in Scandinavia. So it seems like even when you have these really progressive policies, which I think these sociologists would agree are good for lots of reasons, so they don't want to say don't do them, but they have a limited effect. I think the profound takeaway is it's just very difficult once fertility declines to try and challenge it, and it becomes a social norm to have fewer children. Convincing people to have bigger families is really difficult.
And what about when the government implements quite progressive policies, but it's just not matched by what's happening in society? Like I know in Mexico, there was an example of HSBC offering their employees very generous paternity leave.
And none of the men taking it.
None of them took it up.
I'm not too sure what they got right in Scandinavia when those policies were put in place. They were holistic enough that they did affect the business culture and the social culture. But it's interesting, I've spoken to a health economist in particular. His name is Professor David Canning, and he gets governments coming to him and saying, what kind of policies can we put in place to increase fertility? And anytime he suggests something which challenges a social norm or an institution, he gets this pushback. So, for example, he said, well, you need to make your education system more affordable, because prospective parents are saying, I can't afford to hire tutors to keep my child ahead in school because they
Which is very big in East Asia.
Exactly,
actually.
yeah, this culture. And I think South Korea, it was the South Korean government he was speaking to at the time. And they said, well, we don't want to do that because this is our crown jewel. This is why our country is so successful, because we have this competitive education system. And he also said that he advised the government in Japan not to penalize people when they had children out of wedlock, but they were really resistant to that as well. So I think the example from the Scandinavian countries shows that unless the policies are really holistic in trying to, I suppose, change a social culture, a business culture, they're very unlikely to work.
I've heard lots of discussions about why women would choose not to have children in terms of what's happening in society and culturally as well. But how are young men particularly feeling about having kids at the moment?
One of the most fascinating things I've learned recently about childlessness, there's a difference between having fewer children and not having any children at all. There's a different mindset. One of the biggest reasons why people don't have children is because they can't find a partner. That's men or women. What we're seeing now in Europe, and it's likely that other countries will follow in this trend, is a situation where it's men of the lowest income who are most likely to remain childless. And that's involuntarily childless. So it's not that they decide when they're young they don't want to have children. It's that they assume that they will have children, and then as they get older, it doesn't happen. So the poorest men are the most likely to end up not having the children that they wanted. Part of this is likely this idea called the mating gap. It's a term sociologist called Marcia Enhorn coined. She was doing research on egg freezing, and she found all the women that she spoke to, the reason that they were freezing their eggs is because they couldn't find a partner. She realized that part of the reason they couldn't find a partner is that they were looking for someone of their level of education or higher. Whereas we have this situation now where in 60% of countries, women are achieving more in education than men. So if you've got a situation where women are more educated, but less likely to partner with someone who is less well educated, there's a pool of men who aren't eligible, I suppose.
And Stephanie, there's also lots of conversations at the moment, it seems, about young men and how they feel about their place in the world, particularly in the West.
I was reading this interview with the Finnish demographer who was talking about this idea that it's low-income men who are struggling to find their place in the world and also most likely to remain childless. And there was a comment underneath from another researcher who talked about male malaise. He said, this idea of male malaise is misunderstood, its impact on fertility. And what he meant there is this disconnect that is happening when young men are struggling in education, struggling to find work, and women are excelling. So male malaise describes the idea that young men are struggling to understand their place in the world as women are empowered. And that's creating a kind of gap in expectation, say, or a gap in income. So the gap in expectation could be young men who don't expect that they should have a 50-50 partnership at home, and women who expect that. There's a divergence in values. And this researcher, Vincent Straub, was saying that is really going to have a profound effect on fertility. But more than that this generation of struggling men are more likely to suffer from things like alcoholism or drug addiction. They're more likely to become prey to these deaths of despair, depression, anxiety, addiction. And all of those things affect fertility socially, but also biologically. So he was really concerned, he is really concerned that we're overlooking this crisis among young men and that we're overlooking its impact on fertility.
So we've looked at the numbers behind declining fertility rates and the societal factors that are driving that trend. Next, I want to look at the economic implications of the shift and how countries are responding to this new reality.